Not clear to me that this is still a colonial empire. And how much does Putin control what goes on in remote parts of the country? So I gather, for example, when he puts up the draft is not done centrally. It's done by regional governors.
Yeah.
And regional governors, I gather, and this is a question, they're starting to think, well, when the knives come out, do I want my best fighting guys all dead in Ukraine, or do I want them around me? Are we not starting to build alternative centers of power for the inevitable civil war that comes when Putin starts to shake? And yes, he's got his Praetorian Guard.
I love your optimism.
That's not optimism.
How about a step down from that? What if they just stop doing what he tells them to do? What if he says mobilize another 200,000?
The question I want is that there's a common mistake of Americans to look at China or Russia and imagine it as a one unitary, coherent power. Everything's run from Putin. It's a dictator. I mean, Stalin did run everything. And then to look at America and say, oh, God, what a mess. But every country is its own mess, and every dictatorship is weak. And clearly people are looking for the end of this is bad and getting ready for, that when the mafia don dies, there's the knives come out. That's the one thing they don't do well is transfers of power. So what's going on inside Russia if you take this view away from the view of the one dictator runs everything and everybody obeys because there's a Praetorian Guard?
Yeah, you've hit upon the biggest and most important point about authoritarian regimes. They're terrible. They're terrible at everything. But if they only have to succeed at one thing.
Fear.
They have to suppress political alternatives.
Yes.
You see, if there are no political alternatives, they can survive any level of incompetence and criminality and abuse of their population and of their leaders.
North Korea.
Yes.
Venezuela.
But if you have a political alternative, all of a sudden, it's a different dynamic. And so this is why when people talk about deterring China, I have an allergic reaction, because they talk about deterring China. We'll put some economic sanctions on China. We'll deny them some kind of technology or whatever it might be. The way you deter a communist regime or a one-party state or an individual despotism is you create the possibility of alternatives inside the system for others to imagine or exist.
But in Russia, there's this regional alternative, right? There's East Nowhere Stand. You don't have to just take over Moscow.
I've been to East Nowhere Stand. I'm probably the only person of this distinguished panel who's been there. And I won't give you the details about daily life there, and I won't take out my photographs of the trip, but I will try to answer your question, which is to say that it's a demobilization regime. The regime is very good at preventing people from mobilizing. You can't come out on the street. You can't hold a conversation together. You can't get 5 people together in a cafe. That's already illegal, right? So they're great at demobilizing, which is preventing people from gathering, whether in protest or for any reason. Then they switch to mobilization. How's a demobilization regime going to do at mobilization? Well, you can guess. It's going to do the same at mobilization, a demobilization regime, as a democratic regime is going to do on energy policy. Right? You kind of know the answer before the question's even asked in some cases. Right, because, yeah. It's
that's where we try to emulate
It's not their thing. It's just not part of their wheelhouse. And so they flubbed it, and it came out a mess. And yet, more people evidently went along with the mobilization than opposed the mobilization in the end. We're not sure about that because the information is hard to pinpoint, right? You're tracking social media reports in Nowhere Stand and everywhere else. But it looks like they were able to mobilize significant numbers of people. So despite the fact that this was not the regime's forte, despite the fact that people got on buses and swam down rivers to get out of the country, despite everything we heard about, we didn't hear about the part where they reported for duty, they got the semblance of a uniform, they were put on a train, and they got 15 minutes of instruction about how to load a rifle, and then they were put in the field.
Which, by the way, roughly describes how your hero Stalin did when he had to do large-scale mobilization in World War II. It wasn't pretty, but in the end, let's take the case of the war against Finland. They start off terribly. There's a shambolic performance, but they do have ultimately greater strength and they win that war. I wanted to bring this round to Ukraine. To me, however long Putin has, he's probably going to live longer than the decisive phase of this war.
I'll just say, hey, U.S. Lend-Lease played a big role in that, and now the Lend-Lease is going to Ukraine.
Right. So my question for you, Steve, is that he mobilized enough. The system delivered enough men to keep the Russian war effort going, even if it is at a very low level of skill and training. They are also now using missiles as well as Iranian drones to inflict some really major damage on Ukraine's infrastructure. Most of us are following, if we're following it at all, what's going on at the front line, and that is still going Ukraine's way. But if I look at the Ukrainian economy, if I look at the damage that Russia is able to inflict on Ukraine, if I ask myself, how long is the West going to keep writing these checks? I'm getting a little uneasy about where we're going to be if Putin can get through the winter. What's your current read?
You guys are really into this, aren't you?
Yes.
This multi-way conversation of Goodfellas.
Sports is obviously more interesting.
I bet when you call your wives and yet again tell them,
our wives.
and yet again you tell them that you're going to be late for dinner because you're still at the office taping a Goodfellas show, that they actually believe it.
Steve, we're going to swap them out. We're going to swap them out for the wives at some point and just have the wives show.
Wives are way better.
I mean, seriously.
They're prettier.
No, it's smarter too.
It's smarter.
Can we get back to the war?
Why? We were on something good for a second. All right.
The war, yes. Where's it going?
When we have dinner together with our spouses, the topics of conversation are slightly different.
Not
that different.
But not that different.
Just to
All
be clear.
All right. So
You've done enough to eke out some miserable Pyrrhic victory.
So everything starts with the bravery and ingenuity of the Ukrainians. That's why we're in the place we're in. Those people are dying as we speak, as we're taping this show. And they're willing to die for the freedom of their country. And it's an amazing story. It's inspiring, and it's made possible many other consequences that we're benefiting from. So everything starts with the Ukrainian people, and we have to remember that. This is their war. They're doing the fighting. They're doing the dying. And Putin is being degraded, and Xi Jinping is being humiliated, and the European unity and resolve is coming. You want to talk about equations? I know I'm stepping on your turf here, but we have an equation. It's Ukrainian valor plus Russian atrocities equals Western unity and resolve. So the more valor and the more atrocities, and they keep coming, the more we have Western unity and resolve. But it starts with that Ukrainian valor. So where are we in the war? Ukrainians are incredible at information war. It's just breathtaking. I don't know if we're ever going to get to the level that they're at, but I've been going to school at what they've been doing. And it's their Ministry of Defense. It's everything. It's the whole society, but it's even the institutions that we didn't think were very agile have turned out to be amazing. So they come up with this battle plan. First of all, they prevent their capital from being taken. You know that Putin dusted off the Rumsfeld Iraq plan. Remember that? The Rumsfeld Iraq plan? He dusted it off and he says, okay, I'm going to invade a gigantic country with a force that's too small. I'm going to decapitate the regime, and then they're going to welcome me with flowers. And everything's going to be hunky-dory as soon as I decapitate the regime. So our military was breathtaking. We went in there and we crushed every asset the Iraqis had. We decapitated the regime. Our performance was so stunning that the Chinese went into a tizzy and the Russians went into a tizzy from the Iraq War, which was televised. But the plan didn't work in the end because we didn't flip the society just by decapitating the regime, and the force was too small to own the country in a stable way.
Consolidate gains, yeah.
Right. And so the Rumsfeld battle plan didn't work, but Putin dusted it off. He said, we're going to do it again. So they invade a gigantic country with a force that's too small, and they try to decapitate the regime, and the idea is that people are going to welcome them with flowers. Honestly, it's very analogous.
Difference is they had lots of collaborators that they thought were going to help with this, which wasn't
They had
true.
people who took money
Right.
to pretend to be collaborators.
Failure of that collaboration.
I could have done that, but I never take money from the mafia.
Your friends.
But anyway, so the Russian army is not the American army, so they didn't destroy the assets. The Russian army, also, they didn't capture Kiev, they didn't decapitate the regime because the Ukrainians resisted successfully. So, and also they didn't have enough force to occupy the country, and so it was the Rumsfeld battle plan, which failed even worse than the Rumsfeld version of it, because Rumsfeld was actually successful on the battlefield in the initial
Also, to
stages.
some extent, the Soviet-Afghan battle plan. I mean, there was some
Yes.
1979 elements here, which.
Yes, yes, you've heard me talk about that, that Afghanistan in 79 was a coup, not an invasion. They replaced, they murdered the existing Afghan president, they installed their own puppet, and then they decided to stay around and protect themselves with some security force, which was about 80,000 in the beginning, and it grew into invasion, or as the coup grew into an invasion unintended. As George Soros once said to me, an investment is a speculation gone bad. So an invasion is a...
Elon Musk about that.
Yeah, so actually, I don't think anybody needs to tell him. I think it's pretty clear. But an invasion is a coup gone bad in the Ukrainian case, right? Okay. So now let's switch. The Ukrainians defend themselves. Russians make some gains in the east, slogging through a couple of towns, etc. But they're not... they don't have a combined arms operation at scale capability that they're going to take the country, either from the east or the south. The Ukrainians switch over to the NATO battle plan, NATO World War II, NATO Cold War. Why? What am I talking about? If you remember, the Soviets have this massive troop presence and armor in Europe, and it's too big for the West to oppose in a frontal encounter. The Soviets just have way too many troops and way too much armor. But we have a more intelligent plan, which is we're going to destroy their logistics, their supply, and their command and control behind the lines to disrupt their ability to conduct operations. So we're going to fight the battle that we can fight against the army that's bigger than us with more armor. This is what the Ukrainians have switched to. They've switched to this because we enable them with our long-range weaponry that they can strike behind Russian lines, disrupt Russian fuel depots and Russian transportation, Russian communication, command and control, and make the Russians incapable of offensive operations and maybe even loosen them up to push them back a little bit. So this has been a fantastic plan with a twist. The twist was Zelensky decided they were going to do a frontal assault, all the same, on Kherson province in the south to get back the Sea of Azov littoral and to make Crimea vulnerable again. Zelensky comes up with this plan. They take it to our people, and our people say, let's war game that. And they war game that a couple of times, and the Ukrainians pounding the Russian positions, which are well defended, lots of troops dug in, some armor.
And the better troops in the south. The first wave
Exactly.
of replacements are the ones in the north around Kharkiv.
Yeah, and so they can't make any progress in the war games in the south. So gently, our side suggests to the Ukrainians, why don't we attack the weakest part of the Russian front, which is the northeast around the second biggest city, Kharkiv, where the Russians are actually not army there, it's police force, it's National Guard, kind of paramilitary
And these
police.
volunteer battalions that were raised.
Volunteer battalions and some criminal battalions, as the general knows. And so it's the weakest part, and in fact, the Russians decide to withdraw from that area. And so the battle plan is now, it looks like an invasion frontally in the south, but that turns into partly a deception, because now we're going to hit them where they're weak. There's no second echelon, there's no third echelon. They ride those Bushmasters, those fantastic from our Australian friends, those great armored personnel carriers, the Bushmasters and some other great. So the Ukrainians ride into almost empty space because there's very little defense on the Russian side. There's a lot of weaponry that the Ukrainians can capture, Most of it is not usable immediately, but a lot of it is good for spare parts. So it's genius. The same day they hit this area where the Russians are retreating anyway and make the retreat accelerate and capture the weaponry, they go on social media, put up all of the photographs of the captured Russian weapons. They talk about their amazing combined arms operation that they mounted with artillery and tanks and skilled infantry, none of which happened, but all of which Lawrence Friedman tweeted about. Willing dupes are really valuable in a war. And then they asked the Europeans for $17 billion more aid because, look, we can push the Russians back. We can win this war. We can win an offensive. And so it looked like a brilliant offensive that was actually an information war success.
Well, they did take back 1,200 square kilometers in the north by turning them out of positions, which is what you don't want. You don't want to impale yourself on defenses. They did. I think it was.
Yes,
it was the right form of maneuver. Yeah,
it was really, and you know better than I do, General, and you know better than I do where this came from, and you know that this wasn't the original Ukrainian plan, but was modified not in a diktat, but through the wargaming lessons that we imparted. But information war can be just as important, and the maneuvering that happened there. I'm not trying to downgrade it. I'm just trying to say that the great victory was in the information space because Ukrainian morale was boosted, Russian morale and reputation was dented, and then Europeans and Americans, the Allies, said, we can win this thing. Let's support it even more. So Ukrainian valor plus Russian atrocities equals Western unionism. But here's the final twist on this, if you'll let me. I know that they bit your ear off already. I see the general is the one closest to you. Bill,
Mike Tyson here.
I see that I'm not trying to bite your other ear off, but I just want to get one final point in, if this is okay. I know I'm talking too much, but then again, you invited me to the show.
That is the point. It is the whole point of the show, Stephen.
Okay, so here we go. But the Russians can learn too. And the Russians are now fighting the same battle plan adapted from the NATO Cold War experience, which is to say, we don't have the force structure or the weaponry now to have a frontal combined arms operation to push the Ukrainians away. Let's destroy their capability to fight. But we're not going to do that by taking on NATO. We're not going to bomb the bases in Germany or in Poland and elsewhere, Romania, where the weapons are coming from and where they're being shipped into Ukraine and where troops are being trained. We're going to destroy Ukrainian civilian infrastructure. We're going to eliminate their power supply. We're going to cut off their water supply. And we're going to go up the escalation ladder, and we'll get their communications too, because all their communications are just a few Elon Musk-owned satellites, and they're susceptible to Russian destruction. And they're not owned by the Pentagon, they're owned by a private guy. And so Putin can call Elon on the phone and say, Elon, you take those satellites away from Ukraine, or somebody else might take those satellites. So if you can make them unable to fight because they have no power, right? They have no lights, and they have no communications potentially. We haven't gotten to that stage, but that's what I envision as the next stage, if Russia needs that stage. You can get the Ukrainians to be unable to continue the battle until they get power supply back, water supply back, and communicate. So that's where we are in the war right now. That's where we are.
Let's close out with two questions. Your thoughts on near-term outlook for the war and near-term outlook for Putin's Russia.
Yeah, so why didn't we supply the air defense systems more quickly? And secondly, why aren't we doing that now? If the problem is the Russians have enough capability still to knock out the most valuable pieces of Ukraine.
And now with the Iranian drones and probably Iranian missiles.
Exactly, General.
Yeah.
I mean, you know that you would be putting more air defense systems in there immediately, and then they would say, well, we need 100. You would say, okay, I'll give you 200, or I'll give you 500. I'll give you whatever you need, so that instead of 8 missiles of 50 getting through, zero missiles of 50 would get through, and they could rebuild the power plants and the water supply, and then we could figure out alternative communications options if it should come to that. And so that's now. That's where we have to be right now. This is not to say that our support should be unlimited. We're in a democracy. There are trade-offs. There's a legitimate debate here about what the war aims ought to be. But the immediate goal right now is to retain Ukraine's ability to fight through the winter. And we're not doing that as energetically as necessary.
Can I give you another equation?
Yes.
So Russian exports
Yeah.
plus the Western attention deficit disorder equals a huge problem for Zelensky. Because remember, the Russian economy is down maybe 3%. The Ukrainian economy before the attacks on infrastructure was down 30%. And the situation in Ukraine economically is getting worse by the day. Our attention deficit disorder hasn't fully manifested itself, but it will probably become obvious after the midterms that we're not all on board for a war that lasts right the way through next year. And this is why, if you ask the question, what's the short run? The short run is the Ukrainians have got maybe a few more weeks, couple months to make more gains on the ground. But as they're making those gains, their economy is crashing. And we're going to realize that too late. And at that point, it's advantage Putin.
Yeah, I have